We come to be the general's missionaries, as the shirtless women say, and wherever there is a missionary. My general, there is a woman that when women love, we know how to love, my general. We women are passionate, my general. We women are fanatical, my general. And the Peronist party, I honestly confess, is fanatical. We will be loyal until the end, no matter the cost, and even if we are left without a home, thank you.
She was one of the women of the century, actress, politician, activist, and First Lady of Argentina. Her followers called her the standard bearer of the humble or the mother of the shirtless. Meanwhile, her critics accused her of being a show-off, a manipulator, a sentimental dictator who used propaganda to enchant the poor. Her speeches, vigorous and captivating, defended the rights of women and workers, while at the same time worshiping her husband. The president, the general, the leader of a nationalist movement inspired by Benito Mussolini's fascism. She was marked by a duality. Was she a rebellious wife, a submissive subject, a spiritual leader, or a demagogic leader? She was so loved that millions bid her farewell at her premature funeral, and so hated that she was even tortured after her death. She was immediately honored, even with Broadway musicals and Hollywood movies. The figure of Eva Duarte de Perón marked a turning point in Argentine history and continues to captivate the Spanish-speaking imagination. Today we're going to learn about her story beyond the legend and the context that allowed her to become a global icon.
This is Reynaldo Carrillo Vilches speaking. And for those who have asked how to support La Nueva Enciclopedia, I bring you the news that we have created a Patreon with exclusive documentaries on the most controversial topics, with live seminars taught by us, and several more benefits. Your support is essential to keep this project alive. You can find the link below, and in case you don't have an international card for Patreon,
there are several payment options.
And you will also be added to the community. We'll be waiting for you there. Without further ado, let's start today's video.
Eva's duality was marked from the moment she came into the world. The official records indicate that she was born in May 1922 in the city of Junín, but the reality was different. Her mother, Juana Ibarguren, was a humble seamstress from the small town of Bragado, deep in the interior of Buenos Aires province. Eva's father, Juan Duarte, on the other hand, was a rancher, a landowner, the owner of estates, a millionaire, and one of the many conservative Argentine politicians who, through legal tricks, had expropriated land from the Mapuche indigenous people who lived in small settlements called tolderias. Juan Duarte was a tough man who led a double life. He had a legitimate family in Chivilcoy with his wife and children, and at the same time he maintained a secret romance for years with Juana Ibarguren. In La Unión, one of his ranches was near the town of Los Tolos, with Juana Ibarguren. He had 5 children out of wedlock. The youngest of them was named Eva Maria, who was actually born on May 7, 1919, with the help of an indigenous midwife, and without her father's presence. Under the requirements of the law, Eva was registered in the birth record as an illegitimate child. At that time, Argentina was a rural and sparsely populated country, which was expanding thanks to the export of grains, meat, and wool, and to the great immigration of Europeans, who for decades had been seeking better conditions in the mysterious American continent. Eva was of Basque descent and spent the first years of her life in the countryside, amid harsh poverty and the fleeting appearances of her father. But everything changed. One afternoon in 1926, her father, Juan Duarte, let his nephew drive his Chevrolet, and the car violently overturned on one of the streets of their town, resulting in his death instantly. Juana Ibarguren, the mistress, and her children traveled to Chivilcoy to attend Juan Duarte's wake, but the legitimate family, upon seeing their arrival, caused a scene and forbade them from entering. Only thanks to the intervention of a cousin, Eva managed to accompany her father's remains from a distance to the cemetery without any inheritance. Having lost their financial support, Juana Ibarguren and her children have to leave the estate. They moved to Los Toldos, and in 1930, with Eva being 11 years old, they settled in a small house in the city of Junín, in the north of the province. While her mother sold sewing work and her older siblings worked, Eva was able to attend elementary school, and there she showed her early artistic talent. She liked to sing, dance, recite poems, and even performed in youth theater plays such as Arriba Estudiantes, where she showed herself as a strong-willed leader. On July 4, 1933, Eva was the only one in her class to wear a black bow to commemorate the death of former President Hipólito Yrigoyen, a reformist who had been overthrown 3 years earlier. The global economic crisis of 1929 had a profound impact on Argentina, since 80% of its tax revenue came from foreign trade. The Great Depression caused enormous economic deterioration, widespread unemployment, and strong social and political tensions that led to the 1930 coup d'etat. In Argentina, led by José Félix Uriburu, a general influenced by Benito Mussolini's fascism, on September 6, Uriburu seized power, and thus began what many historians have called the infamous decade, one of the most turbulent periods in Argentine history, with electoral fraud, terrible corruption scandals, overpricing, political corporatism, dissolution of parties, press censorship, and persecution of workers, union leaders, and activists. Returning to the life of our protagonist, some authors speculate that Eva may have experienced those political persecutions up close when, at the age of 14, she had a mysterious first love. With Damian Gomez, a young worker who worked on the railroad lines that passed through Junín, and who was soon after arrested for being an anarchist, sent to the city, and disappeared forever in the prisons of Buenos Aires. We don't know if that could have been one of the reasons that motivated Eva, but on January 2, 1935, at about 16 years old, she moved permanently to the capital, the city of Buenos Aires, a city she had idealized with the innocence of her wild youth. In a fragment of her autobiography, she writes, "They spoke of the big city as a wonderful paradise, where everything was beautiful and extraordinary, and it seemed to me that even the people there were more like people than those in my town, and several believed so." A great internal migration that had begun after the Great Depression. Thousands and thousands of indigenous people, mestizos, peasants, and humble townsfolk from the Argentine provinces moved to the capital, Buenos Aires, which was forced to industrialize due to the deteriorating international market. Many locals originally from Buenos Aires contemptuously nicknamed these migrants as cabecitas negras, and Eva considered herself one of them. At first, she lived with her older brother, Juan Duarte, in crowded, cheap, and shabby boarding houses, while she looked for her first jobs as an actress. She was lucky because, a few weeks later, she was hired by the theater company of Eva Franco, a movie and local theater star who had performed under the direction of the poet Federico Garcia Lorca. On March 28, Eva Duarte made her debut with a supporting role in the play La Señora de los Pérez, and the following year, she was already touring the country with the Argentine Company of Comic Comedies at a frantic pace that reached up to 4 performances a day. On July 26, 1936, the newspaper La Capital published her first known public photo. A young lady, slim and shy. Off stage, she answered with a very weak voice, but once on stage it seemed like her voice changed and was different. In this way, she started appearing in radio dramas and went on to star in White Gold, a play about the hard life of cotton workers in Chaco. Radio was then the main mass communication medium. People from different classes could listen to a variety of news, plays, and soccer broadcasts, and the sentimental music of tangos, which was in its golden age under the guidance of Carlos Gardel and Aníbal Troilo. But cinema was also growing throughout the city, and Eva Duarte managed to join the casts of various premieres, such as Seconds Out, The Charge of the Brave, A Bride in Trouble, and The Saddest Man in Town. By 1943, at almost 24 years old, and with a short but considerably successful career, Eva had already managed to leave behind the shabby boarding houses. She had bought herself an apartment in the famous neighborhood of La Recoleta and was hired to do a nighttime radio drama that dramatized the biographies of illustrious and powerful women throughout history. Catherine the Great, Empress Carlota, Elizabeth I of England, Josephine Bonaparte, Napoleon's wife, among others. In some way, Eva starts to identify with those women from the past. While the present world was undergoing an abrupt transformation, World War II was having a severe impact on the nation since the infamous decade. Great Britain had a decisive economic influence in Argentina, but the United States was gaining a hegemonic presence throughout the continent and the world, and was pressuring the American nations to choose its side. In that dreadful war, Argentina had a tradition of neutrality regarding European wars, supplying food to English troops and civilians without being in danger. Taking sides meant risking their ships being attacked by enemy militias of the Axis powers. Between the so-called Allied sympathizers, who supported joining the Allies, and the so-called neutralists, from these differences, the so-called United Officers Group, began to form a secret military lodge within the army made up of young nationalist officers of lower ranks. They sought to put an end to the military leadership of the so-called infamous decade, who in turn were associated with landowners and foreign businessmen. On June 3, 1943, Generals Arturo Razón and Pedro Ramirez decided from Campo Mayo to make a disruptive decision together with their loyal subordinates. The next day, they set out with 8,000 soldiers to overthrow the government of Ramon Castillo. Thus, in this way, after 13 years, the so-called infamous decade, or national organization process, as it was officially called, came to an end. But the scandals didn't end there. In power, Razón, Ramirez, and Farrell followed one another, three military men who were just as controversial as their predecessors. Among their first measures upon coming to power, civil liberties were once again restricted, opponents were repressed, and communist and anarchist activists were arrested. They were sent to prisons in Patagonia, where they were tortured with the newly introduced electric cattle prod. Hundreds of them were killed and thrown into cold, remote warehouses. Perhaps the main and most significant difference from the previous government of the infamous decade was the new labor policy, which, among other actions, began to integrate unions and workers' groups into the state. These labor reforms during times of great change and migration were mainly driven by a politician, Juan Domingo Perón, the right-hand man of President Farrell. Perón was a shrewd, well-educated general who had written plays and essays and who had great political ambitions. As a military observer in Italy, he was able to study and closely admire the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, from which he sought to adopt several principles. For Argentina, the state as the guiding body of national life, the exaltation of nationalism, the appeal to the popular classes, different from conservative movements, and the cult of a supreme leader. In the Italian case, to the great douche. Perón understood that in the growing industrial and mass society, the consolidation of power was achieved by gaining the support of that large mass of internal migrants who came from the Argentine provinces, and that had led to the emergence of a new type of worker in an emerging industrialized city. In June 1943, the Secretariat of Labor and Welfare was created, a state agency that gained the sympathy of hundreds of thousands of humble workers. Through a series of unprecedented measures in Argentina, labor courts for disputes with employers, collective agreements, laws for retirement, paid vacations, salary improvements, and severance pay, and the creation and reorganization of hundreds of unions, such as the Transport Workers Union, the Commerce Employees Union, and especially the General Confederation of Labor, better known as the General Confederation of Labor. And Perón places his Secretariat of Labor as the center of regulation and power for this entire movement. In the case of Eva Duarte, she had already become involved in that union world through her role as an actress. And at the end of 1943, at just 23 years old, she became the first president of the Argentine Radio Association, the first union of radio employees. It was during that time that she crossed paths with General Perón. This is how Juan Perón remembered that moment. Eva came into my life like destiny. It was a tragic earthquake that made me meet my wife. And this was not a metaphor. At the beginning of 1944, the largest earthquake in Argentine history destroyed almost the entire northern city of San Juan and left more than 9,000 dead. The Secretariat of Labor and Welfare then organized an event at the Luna Park Stadium in Buenos Aires, seeking to raise funds for the victims. They say that's where they saw each other for the first time. Eva recalled her first conviction. The conversation went like this, quote, "We talked non-stop about anything. He told me that he liked determined women. That's something I would never forget," end quote. The difference between the two figures was noticeable. She was a captivating young actress of 24, work, and he was a 48-year-old military man, widowed and weathered by time. But from that night on, they would never be apart again. In less than a month, Perón moved to an apartment next to Eva's on Posadas Street. Meanwhile, he kept increasing his power and popularity. Perón was appointed Minister of War and Vice President of the Argentine nation. By 1945, the country was already divided between Peronists and anti-Peronists. With its nuances, this was a tense struggle of the working class against the middle and upper classes. Perón's opponents accused him of practicing demagogic populism, an authoritarian clientelism that used the unions as a political arm and created relationships of dependence with him, the state, through positions, subsidies, and welfare assistance. Meanwhile, Perón's followers considered the labor measures he took to be of great benefit and necessity, and they labeled his critics as allies of an economic and corporate oligarchy that sought Perón's interests, the interests of the rich, and denigrated the rights of the people. Eva Duarte throws herself into supporting her man's political cause and collaborating with Peronist propaganda. She produced programs like Towards a Better Future, a radio show where she promoted the social and labor achievements accomplished by the Secretariat of Labor and Welfare. Then, in April of that year, Eva went to Cordoba to film The Prodigal Woman, a movie where she had to play a wealthy sinner who, repentant of her luxuries, goes to live in the mountains and begins to spend her fortune on the poor. This was Eva's first and last leading role in cinema, but she would never get to see herself on the big screen because Perón himself believed that showing his wife playing a selfish and wasteful woman could affect her public image. For a future election, Argentina was a hotbed of political tensions. On September 19, 1945, the so-called March for the Constitution and Freedom took place. A huge demonstration made up of more than 200,000 people from various sectors who opposed Perón. Members of the Radical Party, business people, merchants, intellectuals, journalists, and students who marched from Congress to the neighborhood of La Recoleta. The protest and the strong social tension had a direct impact on Farrell's government and triggered a series of intense meetings within the military cabinet. Thus, on October 8, General Eduardo Jorge Ábalos demanded that the president remove Juan Domingo from his positions in order to ease the pressure coming from various sectors. Juan Perón, in fact, resigns and is arrested in his apartment and taken by boat to Martín Garcia Island, where persecuted leaders were usually confined. On October 14, Juan Domingo writes a letter to Eva with these words: Today I wrote to Farrell asking him to speed up my retirement as soon as I get out. We'll get married and go anywhere to live in peace. Some believe that for a moment Perón intended to retire for good and go with his wife to Patagonia, but things turned out differently. Through some falsified x-rays, Perón managed to return to the city, convincing them that he had a serious lung problem. And in the meantime, he started putting all his political power into action. Thus, on October 17th, more than 300,000 workers filled the Plaza de Mayo, demanding the release of their leader, Perón. The heat was so intense that day that several people washed their feet in that iconic fountain, a gesture that outraged many opponents. It stamped an icon in history. Bewildered and with no idea how to resolve it, President Farrell asked Perón to get that huge crowd out of the square, to which Perón replied that he would only do it if elections were called for the following year. In this way, along with a series of other negotiated conditions from both sides. At around 11 at night, Perón nervously stepped out onto the balcony of the government house. He asks everyone to sing. He asks them to join his cause, the unity of the workers. The official version gave Eva a decisive role in that massive mobilization that became the founding myth of Peronism. But the truth is that her participation was very limited. Some say that she was hiding in her mother's house, anxiously waiting for the meeting or the outcome of what would happen to her man. In this way, shortly after being released on October 22, Perón traveled to Junín to marry Eva Duarte in an old mansion, with only a few witnesses. From then on, Eva left her career as an actress and devoted herself body and soul to her husband's cause, accompanying him throughout the presidential campaign. He was now determined to reach the highest office in Argentina. Eva's participation in the campaign was something new in the country. The wives of politicians usually played a very secondary role, occasionally taking part in a charity event or an official ceremony. In contrast, Eva Duarte delivered emphatic speeches on the radio, was present at all the tours, and even presented herself as the public face. She was the representative of an important sector that still didn't have a voice in politics: the Argentine woman, the woman from the lower classes. The campaign receives great support. Not only did the unions ally themselves with Peronism, but also several parties such as the Labor Party, the Independent Party, and even a splinter group from the Radical Party. On February 24, 1946, Juan Domingo Perón became the president of the Argentine nation for the first time, with 54% of the votes. After becoming First Lady, Eva Duarte de Perón sought to clean up her past as a child born out of wedlock and ordered her birth date to be changed and to be listed as the daughter of married parents. 3 days after the election, Eva gave her first speech as First Lady, proclaiming these words: "Argentine women have overcome the period of civil tutelage. Women must assert their actions. Women must vote. As the moral backbone of their homes, they must take their place in the complex social machinery of the people." Eva thus became the main Argentine ambassador of a proposal that Peronism itself had been adapting for some time: women's suffrage. Through rallies and radio speeches, Eva encouraged women to demand their right to vote, and eventually, it was achieved. The bill reached the Argentine Senate in August 1946, and in September of the following year, the Chamber of Deputies passed the suffrage law. Eva became Evita to her followers, who saw her as the main driving force behind this achievement. However, critics of the government, including some opposing feminists, accused her of blatant proselytism, using this project to increase the Peronist electorate. In fact, many of Eva's speeches to women revolved around the idealized figure of Juan Domingo Perón. A historian stated that Peronism was fascism, filtered through local cunning, end quote. Many highlight its similarities with that Italian model, the state as the ruler not only of the economy but of all national life, an exaggerated cult of personality, a controlled economy, unions managed by the state, and even some collective symbols, such as the use of torch marches and Perón. In his past, he never hid his appreciation and sympathy for this type of European nationalism, especially Italian fascism. In his first year, the Argentine president dissolved the three parties allied with Peronism to create his own party, which would be called the Peronist Party. In its platform, it defended four economic pillars, so-called internal market, economic nationalism, a predominant state role, and the central role of industry in the economy. During Perón's first term, industries and the central bank were nationalized. Railways, roads, sanitation works, and housing were built. And wages and pensions were increased during ever-growing public spending, which eventually led to rising inflation. Also, during Peronism, the enrollment of children in schools increased on a large scale. Meanwhile, textbooks with drawings, photos, and phrases praising the president were introduced in classrooms. Long live Perón. Perón is a good leader. Perón and Evita love us. For her part, the image of the First Lady was not only praised in the country, but also abroad. In 1947, Eva Perón went on a tour of almost 3 months through Europe and South America, accompanied by some diplomats and her confessor. The Jesuit priest Hernán Benítez was received in Spain by none other than General Francisco Franco, who awarded him the highest Spanish honor, the Grand Cross of Isabella the Catholic. This took place during a celebrated sale of food from Argentina to Spain, at a time when Spain was internationally isolated. Eva also managed to make Franco uncomfortable at the royal monastery of El Escorial. She was surprised by the size and the dozens of empty rooms, and she asked Franco and his wife, Carmen Polo, why they didn't make use of it and turn it into a colony or an orphanage. Eva? Then she went through Italy and the Vatican, where she met Pope Pius XII, who gave her the Golden Rosary and a papal medal. In France, she received the Legion of Honor. And at Notre Dame Cathedral, she spoke with the Apostolic Nuncio of Paris, Monsignor Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, the future Pope John XXIII. But she wasn't so well received everywhere, even while Time magazine dedicated a laudatory cover to her. The magazine France Dimanche published a derogatory photo of her when she was posing for a soap advertisement, alongside another of Perón and with a Mapuche woman. On the streets of Switzerland, people threw stones at her car, and some tomatoes splattered the Swiss Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was accompanying her. Some considered her very close to fascism and suspected that the real purpose of that tour was to deposit Perón's funds in a Swiss tax haven. And there were more surprises by then. A 1948 CIA report indicated that the Argentine president did not maintain contact with war criminals, high-ranking officials, or National Socialist scientists from Germany, but in addition he had helped them escape, granting them visas, false identities, and secret repatriations. Thanks to an international network of contacts, the escape routes, known as the rat lines, started from different points in Europe and sometimes with the help of the church itself. Bishop Alois Judal arranged false passports for fugitives from National Socialism from the Vatican, which were then certified by the Red Cross Committee, and they were allowed to leave Europe to hide in other parts of the world. Researcher Marcelo Garcia found evidence that Eva Perón had also promoted this in Switzerland and Italy. Secret consulates that allowed some of the 5,000 National Socialists to take refuge, who later went into hiding in various regions of Argentina. Among the most notorious cases were Adolf Eichmann in San Miguel, Joseph Mengele in Buenos Aires, and Erich Priebke in Bariloche. The truth is that the presidential duo of Eva and Perón became stronger throughout the term, not only at the political and institutional level, but also in the social imagination of many Argentinians. The president maintained control over traditional institutions, such as the armed forces, the cabinet, and Congress. Meanwhile, Eva actively participated by managing unions, social movements, and being a key spokesperson for the government. Upon his return from Europe, he arranged the purchase of the newspaper Democracia and used it as the main means of expression, printing more than 300,000 copies daily, where she herself published articles on political and social issues with more than obvious titles. Why am I a Peronist? My conversations with General Perón? Social aid, yes. Charity? Don't forget the children. Give up the future. The current duty of Argentine women. The Argentine woman supports the reform towards the total emancipation of the shirtless from the countryside. Among other messages of this kind, Eva also gave intense and emotional speeches, criticizing the elitist oligarchy and highlighting her support for the shirtless, the humble and hardworking people. Perón, the opposition mocked her, highlighting the contrast with her appearance. Eva was an ostentatious woman who liked to wear haute couture dresses and wear jewelry and well-styled hairdos, while launching tirades against the rich. In July 1948, Peronism turned the so-called Buenos Aires Charity Society into what is now called the Eva Perón Foundation, an organization that promoted social aid, assistance, and charity. It distributed books, food, clothing, sewing machines, and toys to needy families throughout the nation. It was responsible for building hospitals, schools, sports fields, and homes for the elderly and for single mothers. In 2 years, more than 13,000 women found employment at the foundation, and more than 8,000 children were enrolled in affiliated schools. Eva believed that social assistance, she saw it as the state's responsibility and was very demanding with herself and others. An assistant said that Eva would arrive at the foundation at 8 in the morning and would leave at 4 in the morning the next day. In order to handle every letter and every complaint like that, her legs would swell and she would take off her shoes under the desk to be barefoot. She could sometimes be very demanding, asking for things immediately when she said, "I want this done by tomorrow." You had to have it ready because if not, she would let insults slip, vent her anger, and get really mad. In just a few years, the assets of the Eva Perón Foundation exceeded 3 billion pesos, more than $200 million at the time. One of the first biographers of Eva, she pointed out that accurate records of the accounts were not always kept because part of the money was allegedly channeled into the president's Swiss bank accounts. The First Lady, Eva Perón, was ambitious and was not satisfied with the foundation. In July 1949, she created the Female Peronist Party at the Cervantes National Theater, a party made up only of women that was organized in neighborhoods, towns, and unions in search of Peronist followers. In her first speech as president, Eva left these words: "We are completely united by the leader, unique and undisputed for all of us. We are united by the great objectives of the doctrine and the Peronist movement. But there is only one thing that separates us. We have our own objective, which is to redeem women." But Eva's health was deteriorating. She suffered several falls and dizziness, and on January 9, 1950, she scared people by fainting in public. She was operated on in the hospital, and the official press reported that she had appendicitis, but the doctors had detected something worse: advanced cervical cancer. In the deepest secrecy, Eva underwent a 1,000-volt radiotherapy treatment at her residence in Recoleta. The 1951 presidential elections were approaching, and the First Lady was seen by Peronism as a figure as popular as its leader. On August 22 of that year, the Central Workers Union called for the so-called Open Town Hall of Justicialism. Millions of Peronists gathered on 9 de Julio Avenue to ask Evita to run for vice president alongside their leader, an event that would be unprecedented in the history of Argentina. Eva didn't want to accept that position and tried to explain to the insistent crowd the rumors that she would accept. They died down for 9 days, until Eva announced on the radio that she would not run for the candidacy, on a date that the Descamisados religiously designate as the Day of Renunciation. A few weeks later, Eva published her book, Evita. It was a mix of autobiography and party manifesto, where she tells about her tough childhood, her role in politics, her fascination with her husband, and her defense of the Peronist political project. But of course, not all of Argentine society agreed with this project. Members of the Radical Party, as well as socialists and communists, faced legal restrictions, surveillance, harassment, and even arbitrary detentions. Opposition newspaper, La Prensa. The Undersecretariat of Information was in charge of persecuting artists who were critical of the party with blacklists. The novelist Ernesto Sabato suffered the revocation of his university professorship after publishing a cynical article against Peronism. The painter Antonio Berni lost his position at the School of Fine Arts for refusing to participate in official events. The communist folk singer Atahualpa Yupanqui was arrested, tortured, and exiled, leaving behind some verses about that time like these. No matter how hard they hit me, they won't make me bend. My body is in the cell and my heart is in the street. Even certain military sectors resisted Peronism. On September 28, 1951, retired General Benjamin Menendez gathered troops from the Army, Navy, and Air Force to issue a proclamation, a program that accused the president of leading the nation of Brazil to a total collapse of its internal and external credit, both morally and spiritually, as well as materially. This group of officers tried to carry out a coup d'etat with 30 tanks, but they were only able to mobilize 7 due to malfunctions, and Menendez ended up being sentenced to 15 years in prison. There was a strange atmosphere of excitement and concern. The elections were approaching, but Evita was appearing less and less in public. On November 6, she was operated on by the American oncologist George Pack at the Presidente Perón Polyclinic Hospital in Avellaneda. They say that on some of the walls in Buenos Aires, unpleasant graffiti appeared with the phrase, "Long live cancer," celebrating the agony of Eva Duarte. On November 11, the First Lady voted while convalescing from her hospital bed. In the first election in Argentine history with women's suffrage, Juan Domingo Perón won with an overwhelming 63% to begin his second term, but he couldn't celebrate it. In private, Eva was a shadow of what she once was. She was gaunt, pale, emaciated, and suffered from terrible fatigue. On May 1, 1952, Labor Day, she gave her last speech to say goodbye to her beloved Descamisados.
I'm not worth anything for what I've done. I'm not worth anything for what I am or for what I have. I have only one thing that matters. I have it in my heart. It burns in my soul. It hurts in my flesh. And it burns in my being. It's the love for these people. If these people asked me for my life, I would give it to them singing. Because the happiness of a single descamisado, the simplest one, I decide only one thing. I am sure that soon I will be with you, but if I am not able to be because of my health, help Perón. Stay loyal to Perón as you have until now. I never sought nor do I want anything. For me, my glory is and will always be Perón's field. The people.
In that environment, Perón grants Eva Perón the title of spiritual leader of the Argentine nation. And at the presidential inauguration, she was so ill that she had to wear a frame made of plaster and wire under her coat to stay standing. Legend has it that the president allegedly had her undergo a lobotomy in the final weeks to relieve the pain she endured after this slow agony. The truth is that Eva Duarte de Perón died on July 26, 1952. On a cold and rainy winter night, holding the papal medal in her hand, she was only 33 years old. Knowing the social magnitude of her death, Perón called the Spanish doctor and asked him to embalm Eva's body so that a lengthy state funeral could be held for 15 days. About 3 million Argentinians. National Congress to approach the First Lady's coffin. The wake was heartbreaking. People, especially from many humble backgrounds, cried and fainted as if it were a close family member. Eva Duarte de Perón, however, could not rest in peace. She went through a real ordeal after her death. Inspired by the corpse of Vladimir Lenin, Juan Perón displayed his wife's embalmed body for 2 years in the building of the General Confederation of Labor under the supervision of Ara Saria. In 1955, General Aramburu orchestrated a coup d'etat, bombing Plaza de Mayo and forcing Perón to flee into exile between different countries until he finally arrived in Spain. The new government set out to neutralize and persecute the strongholds of Peronism. Fearing that Eva's body would become a sacred pilgrimage site for Peronists, the new government ordered intelligence Colonel Murray Conning to make Eva's corpse disappear. Conning secretly moved Eva's body in a trunk and then handed it over to the officer. Arandia, paranoid, hid it. During those days, Arandia slept with a 9mm pistol and a corpse under his bed. One night, he wakes up startled and believing he sees Evita's body resurrected. He shoots and kills his wife, who was 8 months pregnant. Conning then decides to keep Eva's body in some radio boxes in his office until General Aramburu orders him to have the corpse removed from the country. The body was transferred to Italy under the name Maria Maggi de Magistris, an Italian woman who had died in a terrible accident. There, she was buried in a cemetery in Milan, and to keep up appearances, they asked a nun to bring her flowers every year. The body was kept in absolute secrecy for 16 years, until in 1970 the Peronist Montonero guerrillas kidnapped Aramburu. During the interrogation, the general confessed that Eva's body was in Italy. Different groups then began efforts to recover it. And in September 1971, Juan Domingo Perón was surprised to receive the corpse of his former wife at his residence in Puerta de Hierro, Madrid. The forensic doctors explained to the former president that the body was damaged and had been tortured post-mortem. The first floor of that residence where Perón lived with his new wife Isabel and his friend José López Rega, the former Minister of Social Welfare. López Rega was nicknamed the Sorcerer because of his esoteric and occult inclinations, which he demonstrated at that time as he tried to perform energetic implantations, end quote, from the dead hands of Eva to the terrified hands of Isabel. We don't know if this helped much, but in 1973, Perón returned with his wife to take office for his third presidency, and a year later serving as president of Argentina. Juan Perón dies in office, and the presidency is assumed by the vice president of the republic, his wife Isabel Perón. The intention of the Peronists was to bring together the bodies of Eva and Juan Domingo in a crypt at the presidential residence in Olivos. However, in March 1976, a new dictatorship broke out in Argentina under the leadership of Jorge Rafael Videla, who requested, quote, that those mummies be removed from the presidential residence. The most radical opponents of Peronism suggested burning Eva's corpse, throwing it into the sea, or dissolving it in acid, but in order to avoid creating more problems. They went to the cemetery. Some believed that Eva carried a curse because the driver of the ambulance carrying the coffin suffered a heart attack on the way, crashed brutally, and did not survive. The odyssey of that corpse was so incredible, so full of twists, so tragic, that the writer Tomás Eloy Martínez dedicated a novel to it called Santa Evita. The remains of Eva Duarte de Perón rest in the Duarte family mausoleum inside the La Recoleta cemetery, but her controversial and emblematic legacy has persisted. Legend or reality? She has become a two-sided symbol, an admired feminist leader and the loyal wife of an autocrat, a tireless promoter of social rights, and the spokesperson for a populist government, a protector of the humble and an activist of exalted rationalism. Eva was perhaps all of these, and maybe she was more. Thank you for watching this video. Your support means a lot to us by leaving your comments, giving us a like, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with all your friends, and clicking the bell to activate notifications. This was Reinaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support and many blessings to everyone.